Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box. Well, everyone knows and loves Gary Wright. He's the dream weaver whose love was alive even when he had a blind feeling. Of course, he was a great solo artist from the mid 70s up until his relatively recent and tragic death. And he was, interestingly, someone who was great collaborators and friends with two of the Beatles. His early career involved collaborations with George Harrison, and the final decades of his life saw him collaborate a lot with Ringo Starr in various incarnations of the All Star Band. But I want to talk about one of the first bands Gary Wright was in that really made a lot of noise, sold a number of records, but not as much as they should, because they were a really great band, and in many ways, they were ahead of their time. I'm talking, of course, about Spooky Tooth, and they were formed in 1967, and they soon started to develop a kind of quintessential hard blues rocking format that really paved the way for future bands like Bad Company, who became superstars in the 70s, the mid 70s in particular. Of course, Bad Company's pedigree was that of Free, and again, a similar style to Spooky Tooth. But while we hear about Free a lot as the great band that led to the more commercial Bad Company, not enough is said about just how great Spooky Tooth was. Perhaps one of the reasons that they're not remembered as much as they should be is because between 1970 and 72, the band broke up. So there are really two stages of Spooky Tooth. Now, their breakout album and the album that sold higher than any of their others was 1969's Spooky 2. And this is an absolute bona fide classic of that blues rock genre. Everyone ought to have a copy of it. They followed it up, however, with a much more experimental album that saw them collaborating with the musique concrète avant-garde composer Pierre Henry of France. And while this album's reputation has gained over time because of the risk they took in recording something so experimental, it wasn't what people had come to expect. This was followed up by an album mostly of covers called The Last Puff, and that's when they broke up for the first time. They reformed, though, in 1972, and in 1973, they released one of their very finest albums, an album everyone should listen to, and that's You Broke My Heart, So I Busted Your Jaw. Funny little title there. And here, the guitar player was Mick Jones. While the original guitar player was Luther Grosvenor, now we see Mick Jones entering the picture because Luther went on to other postures, including joining Mott the Hoople. Now, Mick Jones is someone with an amazing pedigree of his own, because after Spooky Tooth, he would go on to form a little band called Foreigner, which of course weren't little at all because they were one of the top selling bands of the late 70s, 80s, into the 90s with the huge hits. You know them all. I Want to Know What Love Is, Double Vision, Feels Like the First Time, and those are just a few. Cold as Ice, we know them all. The core lineup in both the first and second versions of Spooky Tooth was centered on Gary Wright, who wrote most of the songs, was a co-lead vocalist and keyboard player alongside a fellow keyboard player and co-lead vocalist, Mike Harrison. So those two really formed the core of Spooky Tooth. Original bassist Greg Ridley had a pedigree of his own because he went on to form Humble Pie. Now, You Broke My Heart, So I Busted Your Jaw really follows a similar format to Spooky 2, but in some ways, the writing is even more sophisticated as Gary Wright was really, really coming into his own as an absolutely fantastic songwriter, great vocalist, great keyboard player, supremely talented musician. And this was followed up later in the same year, 1973, with an album called Witness, which followed a similar format. Now, Spooky Tooth, I would say the three best albums are the second album, literally called Spooky 2, then You Broke My Heart, So I Busted Your Jaw, and then Witness, because those albums really capture this quintessential sound. The final album ever is one that you really ought to listen to as well. Gary Wright is obviously still very much in the driver's seat, but Harrison left, and so he was joined by another co-lead vocalist, Mike Patto, who formed the cult band in Britain called Patter later on that really had a huge underground following, and they sold a decent amount of records, mainly in the UK in the 70s. And that album in many ways even pushes the boundaries further compared to Witness, but while retaining that classic blues rock sound, and Gary Wright's songwriting continues to carry the band forward. So the question is, while people loved Free, and while Bad Company won Stratospheric, and while people like Robin Trower in a much more lead guitar driven blues rock style was selling a lot of albums, more so in the US than anywhere else, Spooky Tooth was a band that, while they sold a respectable amount of albums in all of the key markets, they never were as big as they ought to have been. Luckily, most of the core members of the band, Gary Wright and Mick Jones in particular, went on to superstardom in their own right. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore Spooky Tooth, because the songs are really, really good. You could argue that the writing that Gary Wright, say it 3 times, produced in Spooky Tooth was absolutely as good as any of the stuff that he produced in his laureled and multi-million record selling solo career. All of their stuff has been reissued many times. It's all on the streaming services that you're all familiar with. So there's really no excuse to listen to Spooky Tooth. But unfortunately, because of Gary Wright's death, it will be impossible for a reunion to take place, even though they did reunite in the 90s and a little bit after that, with various incarnations of the original lineups. And so 74 wasn't the ultimate goodbye to Spooky Tooth, but it was the penultimate goodbye and the last truly great album they made. That is 1974's The Mirror. So I would definitely check them out, even check out some of their more obscure material. A few years ago, they put out a live record that was recorded in 1973 when they were at the peak of the Mick Jones, Gary Wright, Mike Harrison lineup. And that lineup can also be seen on Musik Ladin, a Radio Bremen produced show from West Germany, basically Beat Club, the famous Beat Club, but it changed its name after, I think, 1973. But the format of basic live performances with no frills was retained. So absolutely check that out, because they sounded as good live, arguably better, as they did in the studio. The guys could play. A rock solid band, and I think a really underrated one too. So that's Spooky Tooth for you, not the dentist's favorite, but one of mine. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Bye bye.